Appreciate you coming on and doing this with us, Christina.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I think since it's about 5 minutes after 2 here in the Eastern Coast, we might as well get started. So first of all, welcome and thank you, Christina, for joining us. Christina is going to be talking about the powerful nutritional strategies for effective addiction treatment and sustained recovery, which is also the upcoming topic of our conference that she's going to be having here in Ohio in the end of April, beginning of May, and I'll let her talk a little bit more about that. But first of all, I want to have the pleasure today of introducing Christina Veselak. Christina is the founder and director of the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition. She has been a licensed psychotherapist for over 30 years and currently provides online relapse prevention coaching and mental health nutrition to a wide variety of clients. Christina consults for supplements company as well as IV detox program, and her CV goes on and on. So I'm just going to bring some of the highlights and I'll let her talk a little bit more because I don't want to take precious time away from her lecture here. She's also an experienced speaker and has presented at conference and training around the country. Christina was one of the founding members and former executive director of the Alliance for Addiction Solutions, the nonprofit organization that is providing these particular forums on a monthly basis. So if you are a member, we thank you for that. And if not, please consider joining us and as even donating to our alliance as a nonprofit. And beside all that, Christina has also been my mentor and a good friend for several years. So I'm really glad and honored this afternoon to present you Christina Veselak. Thank you, Christina.
Salvatore, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here, everyone, especially since the Alliance is very, very close to my heart, since I was one of the founding members in 2007. And in 2007, Carolyn Rubin, who then ran a nonprofit organization called CARA, Community Addiction Response Association, something like that, in Sacramento, where they were doing nutritional interventions to great effect in drug court, and pulled together a lot of the people around the country who had been using nutrition for addiction recovery, but more, everybody kind of on our own. And so she pulled together the first, I think it was the first ever conference on this. I think maybe Kenneth Blum had done something earlier, but this is the first big public conference that she did in 2007 that I had the privilege of speaking at. And it was after that conference, for those of you who don't know, that several of us stayed and founded, sitting by the swimming pool at this hotel, we founded the Alliance for Addiction Solutions. Now, it took a couple months before we agreed upon the name, and we were all tossing around names for a couple months, but we finally landed on Alliance because we all wanted to be allies of each other. We wanted to come together because we felt that we would all be stronger together than separately. And we knew we had solutions for addiction and mental health issues that nobody else had discovered, nobody else knew about. But these were very real, powerful solutions. And thence the name, Alliance for Addiction Solutions. And this is now, going on 20 years later. And so more power to all of us. In fact, I think we should give the current board a round of applause for still hanging in there and still keeping this wonderful, wonderful organization and message alive. All right. I am a licensed psychotherapist. I've been licensed for about 40 years, working in the addiction field for about 40 years. And just around 30 years ago, I became trained as a nutritionist. I had met Julia Ross and was learning all about amino acid therapy from her and Don Tyson, who was selling aminos way back in the day. And I was so excited by everything I was learning that I got the same training as Julia's nutritionist. And then I started training under Dr. Jeffrey Bland, who is the founder of Institute for Functional Medicine, before he'd even coined the term functional medicine. But he was teaching this all around the country. And so I was just following him around. And at first, 75% of what he was teaching was over my head, and then 50%, and then 25%. And now I'm teaching it, which is all very wonderful. So this really brings me up to 2001 when I moved, a couple of years after I moved to Denver, Colorado. I'd spent a couple of years working, managing a vitamin store, which was incredible training. And then I felt ready to reopen a psychotherapy practice in Denver and fully integrate nutrition into my practice as a counselor. But I was also specializing, part of my practice specialized in the chronic relapser. Those very wonderful people, very committed, very dedicated, and very desperate people who went to program after program to try to figure out how to get and stay, addiction free. And it never stuck. Going to meeting after meeting, maybe even 3 meetings a day by bus because they no longer had a driver's license. And it never stuck. In spite of trying everything that anybody had told them to do, they still kept relapsing. And so I asked my colleagues in Denver to send to me your treatment failures. And, the people who were just so discouraged and wanting to give up, from the treatment professionals who were so discouraged and wanting to give up. And I said, send them to me. Now, did I win everybody? No. But I was able to troubleshoot for 20 years in Denver, person after person after person, and figure out what the blocks were in their recovery journey and turn it around. And it was because of that 20-year experience, first 15, 14 years in, that I founded the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition to teach other practitioners what I had learned the hard way. And then a couple of years ago, my nonprofit, Eating Protein Saves Lives, because it does. And now, most recently, the conference that we're putting on in 8 weeks in Columbus, Ohio. And I really hope you can all join us there. Feed the Recovering Brain. Because what I learned in that 20 years of working with other people's treatment failures is what this entire conference is going to be about. So, what did I learn? What I learned, first of all, is that everybody has different stories. Everybody has different sticking points. And it takes a lot of very loving, very careful, respectful questioning to find out what the specific blocks for everybody was. But there were a few things that it turned out everybody had in common. The first thing that pretty much everybody had in common was a starving brain. Now, you've all heard me talk about starving brains before, but I saw it day in and day out in this practice of mine, where people with a history of chronic relapse were coming in, and I would ask them, I finally learned to ask the question. It took me a while to figure out that this was the question to ask. But When was the last time you ate protein prior to your last craving, your last slip, or full-blown relapse, or even your last down? 9 times out of 10, is that people weren't eating. Not only weren't they eating protein, but they also weren't eating real food. They were living on ultra highly processed food, junk food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Nobody had ever told them in treatment, and these are people who've been through 5 treatment programs and meeting after meeting. Nobody had ever told them, because they weren't taught, that what and when you ate mattered tremendously to your recovery. Now, they were taught, as we all were taught, are being taught, that it's a good idea to eat healthy. We should all be eating healthy. Now, what eating healthy means kind of varies from person to person and program to program, but we all know we're supposed to eat healthy. And it's like, yeah, I'll start that tomorrow. I'll start that tomorrow. Or I'll have a big salad for lunch. Glass of orange juice for breakfast. That's healthy, isn't it? Somebody actually said, when I asked when was the last time you ate protein, they said, oh, I had an apple today. That's protein, isn't it? And I had to say, well, I'm really glad you ate an apple today. That's really good for you. And in fact, we're being told to eat, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But no, it's not protein. When I was running my DUI groups and my domestic violence groups, I would be asking people, these are people who are really struggling in treatment. What did who here had breakfast? Half the room would raise their hand. What did you have for breakfast? And there was always one smart aleck who had bacon and eggs, okay. Everybody else had Mountain Dew and Captain Crunch for breakfast. Almost like a uniform. It's like, if we have issues with alcohol or, domestic violence, this is for breakfast. And so I challenged them. I would say, hey, rather than eating Captain Crunch and Mountain Dew for breakfast every single morning, and maybe for lunch as well, why don't you have bacon and eggs? Why don't you have a real breakfast? For 1 week. Try it just for 1 week. Okay, you can do anything for 7 days. And they would come back a week later with tears streaming down their eyes saying, how come nobody ever told me this before? Because it turns out that when you tell people not just to eat healthy because it's good for you, but that if you eat 20 grams of protein every 4 hours along with other real food, it will make you feel less depressed, less anxious, help you sleep better, and most importantly, cut down your cravings and therefore your relapse. Now they're listening, because that hits them where they live. So most of the time, people just simply weren't eating, and I would get them eating. And again, it took me a little while to sort of figure out my current formula, 20 grams of protein every 4 hours, but I finally landed on it, and it became a game changer for people. Because finally their brains were working and they could think and they could pay attention and they could make decisions and they could get to meetings on time and they could even stay awake in meetings. I don't know if you guys have ever gone to like an AA meeting where people were, drinking coffee and eating donuts and watching all the people nod off because of the high carbs. Once those people start eating protein at the meeting, rather than the donuts, now they can stay awake. So this was the first major game changer for my clients. And yes, it can be hard to make these type of lifestyle changes. You have to do some really, troubleshooting and problem solving and sometimes be really patient. I got a lot of referrals from impaired nurses from an organization that worked with nurses who were wanting to get their licenses back. And they would come and see me. Well, they were working 12-hour shifts with no time for snacks or lunch. And people wonder why they were, using drugs just to keep going. And so troubleshooting, how are you actually going to feed yourself consistently? It takes some work. But the people who were able to do it, their lives turned around. Now, that was not the only issue, although that was a foundational issue. Then it was the people who had ADHD. And we know that a good 60% of people in treatment for substance use disorders have attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity. And that this disorder, first of all, set them up for addiction in the first place, but also set them up for relapse. How? Well, if any of you have ever lived with ADD, and I did for the first 46 years of my life, and it derailed my life in many, many ways. As a kid in school with ADD, you quickly find out that you're different, that you have to work twice as hard as your classmate to get the same grades. You may be really, really smart, but it just doesn't come as easy to you as it does to them. And you may lose your homework, or you may forget your homework, or you may space out while the teacher is speaking, or. And what does all of this do? This leads to profound shame and profound guilt. We can't keep our desks as neat as our classmates. We can't keep our rooms the way our parents want to keep our rooms. We may forget to do our chores or kind of do them half-assed because we lose out of brain energy. And so we get into trouble. And so we feel even more ashamed and guilty and embarrassed and like failures. And this impacts people in different ways, but it impacts every single one of us with ADD. And so many people by mid-adolescence just simply give up, don't believe they can do it. Start running with a bad crowd or start looking for relief from the really intense emotional pain and experience of failure. And this can be your first step into addictive behavior. Now, I think I was always afraid of losing control, and I didn't like the feeling of being drunk. So I never got into substances. But when I was in third grade and started going to a new school where it was one of those really not good schools, I turned to reading to cope. I became a compulsive reader. Anybody else here who's a compulsive reader? I know that we exist. I'm not the only one. And I couldn't keep up with the teacher because of my undiagnosed ADD. And yep, Elena. And I would bring 3 books to school with me. And I would pull book out, and start reading it, and the teacher would take it away from me, pull another book out and read it, and the teacher would take it away from me, and then she would give up with the 3rd book. Well, because I was really smart, reading in 3rd grade at a junior high and high school level, and I was reading history, I was reading science, and I was reading all sorts of wonderful things. And I was giving myself quite an enormous education. I was but getting more and more behind. And I couldn't do the homework because I was getting more and more behind because I was reading. and they decided that I was a slow learner. They weren't asking me questions about what I was reading. They might have gotten a somewhat different perspective had they. But I also wasn't socializing because I was reading. I was isolating, and then I was getting teased. And so I didn't build social skills. And so reading, compulsive reading, became my mainstay to cope with my ADD and my social anxiety and my shyness and my deep emotional pain. To the point that when I was driving and anxiety would hit me, I would actually pull a book out and I would read while driving, which is, unfortunately, I never got any negative consequences, but I very easily could have. You're really not supposed to read in the middle of the freeway, while driving. So people turn to different escape mechanisms to cope with the pain of ADHD and of trauma, of PTSD, which I also had. And then we get trapped by our addiction and we get dragged down no matter what that was. So many people end up in addiction because of ADHD, and then they get clean and sober, and maybe their brains don't work quite as well because they were using meth or cocaine to fire those little catecholamine synapses and think more clearly and pay better attention and have more energy and focus. And they stop using meth and they're back to square one. They can't pay attention in the groups. They can't do the treatment homework. They can't get anywhere on time. And this just supports this feeling of failure. I just read a post in a group on Facebook, recovery group, where this gentleman was saying that his doctor didn't want to put him on Adderall for his ADHD because he was a meth user and he couldn't function in his life anymore. So he went back to meth just so that he could keep his job. Because nobody told him about amino acids. So I responded and said, hey, have you ever heard of amino acids? Have you ever heard of tyrosine? Have you ever heard of, theanine? It can help your brain go in a straight line. Fish oil, so that you don't need either your meth or your stimulant meds, on the other hand. And he was so incredibly grateful because nobody had ever told him this before. So many of my chronically relapsing clients were tripping over ADHD and getting them again on the diet, getting them on the right supplements, maybe getting them the right ADHD coach, made all the difference in the world for these people. One of the other things that people were tripping over was traumatic brain injury. And traumatic brain injury can actually show up as ADHD, but it shows up in other ways as well. Brain fatigue, where you just can't concentrate for long periods of time, where you can't, read recovery material for long periods of time, or even listen to it, where you may have headaches, where you may be dizzy, where you may oversleep, where you may get exhausted very, very quickly and can't participate in all the treatment activities. And again, as human beings, and especially as human beings in early recovery, what do we do with this? We turn it into shame and we beat ourselves up. And we feel even more emotional pain. And then very often we just want to give up because it's all way too much. And these are even people who, have been treated for their brain injuries and yet are still having really significant cognitive issues. I was actually at a lecture at an addiction conference a couple of years ago where the topic was, what type of accommodations you need to put in place for your clients with traumatic brain injury. Now, what do I mean by traumatic brain injury? You know, we think of going into a coma, losing consciousness, or a great big concussion, or even seeing stars. And yes, all of these things are true and can have, severe effects for even decades afterwards. But it turns out that even less severe bumps on the brain, when cumulative, can have a cumulative effect. A little fall here, a little bang there, a little hit there, it adds up to significant brain damage. So does, by the way, and I hadn't thought about this before, but when in my new podcast, and if you haven't listened to it, please do, it's called Power Up Recovery with Nutrition. I interviewed Dr. Michael Lewis, who's one of the premier researchers in this country using high-dose fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids to help reduce brain inflammation for people with traumatic brain injury, but also any type of brain inflammatory disorder. According to him, people who have overdosed, right, and who have almost died from opioid overdose, and many people, if you've had one overdose, you've had 10. Each one you've had, you've created more inflammation and more brain injury and more experience of anoxia, where there hasn't been enough oxygen to the brain. And this also is cumulative and never ever talked about. And so Dr. Lewis found, and I was so grateful to have read his book in 2017 that talked about this, using high-dose fish oil will turn around these symptoms and can even turn off these symptoms within a week. This is really miraculous, but you're not going to hear anybody in a treatment program talk about it. But now I had a tool for my clients with TBIs that really worked. And here's a story for you. The particular client didn't actually have an addiction history. He was actually way too ill for that. In 2017, I read Dr. Lewis's book, When Brains Collide. And within just a couple of weeks, this lady calls me up and says, I was referred to you brain injury 30 years ago, or more than 2 minutes at a time without getting sharp stabbing pains in his brain and literally collapsing to the ground. And I'm thinking, I can't do anything for him. He'd been to all of the top brain injury clinics in the country. I said, but I just read this book. And this is what this researcher said, and this is what the book says to do. And it says to take 5 grams of a good quality fish oil 3 times a day with food for a week. I said, I've never tried it before with anybody, but it's not going to hurt, I don't think. Do you want to try it? Exactly how that conversation went. And this woman was so desperate that she said, sure. And a week later, her husband was able to stand up for 10 minutes at a time without getting sharp stabbing pains and collapsing. And 3 months later, this man could now be left alone at home for the first time in 30 years. He could walk around his house. He could do light chores. And he had his life back. Now, I had also thrown in some other brain anti-inflammatories like NAC and phosphatidylserine, which are also very helpful in lowering brain inflammation. But this totally transformed his life. And so these are very, very powerful tools that we have that most, treatment professionals and treatment program directors don't know anything about. And so their clients with these issues just keep on leaving treatment or failing and feeling more and more embarrassed and more ashamed and more despairing and more just wanting to escape into drug use because why bother? It's not going to work. And then I had women with hormonal issues, which had never been picked up. And some of you who know me know these stories. But it turns out that when women relapse, most of the time we relapse premenstrually. And so it's a really good idea if you're working with, women of childbearing age who are still bleeding monthly, to have them track their cycles. And even if they're on the pill, they're still cycling to some degree, have them track it and track their moods, behaviors, and cravings. Because what happens within the 10 days of estrogen and progesterone hitting zero is that people start getting anxious and agitated and depressed and irritable and sugar craving and may have trouble sleeping and what also happens is that people in early recovery from addiction have cravings for their drug of choice, because whenever we're destabilized, we have this unconscious conditioned response in the brain to reach for our drug or behavior of choice, to calm down our brain and bring us back to homeostasis. Also, when estrogen drops near the end of the month, serotonin drops. You all know the symptoms of low serotonin. When progesterone drops at the end of the month, so does GABA, and we all know the symptoms of low GABA. So it's a perfect storm for women. And yet this is also never tracked in treatment programs. So it's really important to be asking our women, hey, where were you in your cycle the last time you had a craving or a slip or you blew out of treatment, right? Let's look at all of our women who blow out of treatment the first week and find out where they are in their cycles, or the second week, or maybe the third week, right? Turns out that most women end up getting arrested for crimes premenstrually, and they actually start their periods in prison or in jail. So, bearing this in mind, and what do? We bring in protein every 3 hours. We bring in extra 5-HTP. We bring in extra GABA. We bring in extra protection. And women, can now make it through this high-risk time with ease and with success. And to women who've been struggling month after month and year after year, this feels miraculous. And it is miraculous. And then we have menopause. And so many, there's been research done that shows that the 2 years before and the 2 years after bleeding stops for women is an extremely high risk time for women to have a relapse into a mental health disorder or an addictive disorder, or create a new one, either mental health or addictive disorder, for the first time ever. Because hormones are unstable, everything's unstable, and women can be at very, very high risk. But again, we're not taught to ask our older women who get into treatment or who blow out of treatment, where are you in relationship to menopause? When did your bleeding stop? Or has it? And I had one woman who was a chronic relapser. She'd been into inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, meetings. Nothing was working. She got sent to me And it turned out that while she had been a sort of a maintenance alcoholic her whole life and shoplifted periodically, she had never gotten into trouble behind either activity. But over the last 2 years, she had gotten four shoplifting charges, 2 domestic violence charges behind being drunk, and 2 DUIs. So I asked her, I said, well, what happened 2 years ago? And she said, well, 4 years ago, my father died, and this is all because he died. And I said, yeah, but that was 4 years ago. And you're telling me that all this stuff happened 2 years ago. And then I asked, have you gone through menopause? And she said, yes, 2 years ago. Bingo. Now, I was the only one of any of her treatment providers who had ever thought to ask that question. But that was the issue. And so I sent her I got her on the diet and I got her on the amino acids, and we started doing just straight relapse prevention counseling. But I also sent her to a nurse practitioner to get hormone testing, and all her hormones were out of whack, not just her reproductive hormones, but her vitamin D was very low. She was hypothyroid. She was deficient in a number of nutrients. And so the nurse practitioner, got her on vitamin D and got her on levothyroxine and got her on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. And she stabilized and her cravings went away and she didn't want to shoplift anymore. And her whole life turned around to the point, but she was terrified of going to jail because she was getting set up for that. So the nurse practitioner and I wrote both her lawyers and the judge and said, look, this is a medical issue. And this woman is in compliance with her medical treatment. She does not deserve to go to jail. And they put her on probation and 2 years of community service. And this woman is sober today. Same thing with men. I've had men have trouble because their testosterone had dropped tremendously, and they were using substances to make up for the low testosterone. And once we identified it and got it replaced, got it to where it needed to be, their cravings went away because they didn't need to make up anymore for their lack of muscle strength and their lack of energy and their depression. So these are the questions to ask. And these are the topics. Well, we also have insomnia. Insomnia is a huge driver of addiction in the first place. People start getting, dependent upon various addictive substances in order to help them sleep at night. I had one woman who had MS, and it started with 1 glass of wine every night when she went to bed to help her sleep. And then that morphed into 2 glasses of wine and 4 glasses of wine and an entire bottle. And she went through treatment and she stopped drinking and she went to AA and did beautifully in AA and loved it and became a sponsor and didn't tell anybody that she had started drinking again until she became unconscious behind a locked bathroom door, and her family had to actually knock down the bathroom door to get to her. And she was so ashamed. And she came to me, and it turned out that not only was insomnia a huge issue for her, but so was her very severe unhealed childhood trauma. We'll talk about trauma in a minute. And so in working with me, she was able to finally get and stay clean and sober. Because we were feeding her brain, we were using the aminos to get her sleeping, we were doing trauma work to overcome the childhood trauma, and she did beautifully until her MS got to the point where she had very severe foot pain. And the doctor had put her on Neurontin for her foot pain and gabapentin. And it wasn't strong enough, so he doubled the dose. And she became acutely suicidal behind the high gabapentin dose. Her father had actually killed himself as a result of antidepressants. And so I pointed out to her that I thought that her becoming suicidal was due to the gabapentin. And first she just blew me off. And then she decided I was right and cold turkeyed off it, which was a really bad idea. She didn't tell me that. And she went into this horrific panic attack for 24 hours over Easter weekend and called me up and said, I need to go to the emergency room, but there's nobody here to drive me. And so I went to her room Easter Sunday morning, her house, and with a bottle of theanine, and we were able to use theanine to offset the withdrawal symptoms from the gabapentin. And then she used hypnosis to deal with the chronic pain, and it worked beautifully. So insomnia is a huge issue, and we can address insomnia in many, many different ways using amino acids. And actually, Dr. Hyla Cass is going to be speaking at the conference on using amino acids and other nutrients for insomnia. Dr. Michael Lewis is going to be talking about fish oil for brain inflammation and traumatic brain injury. We have a Dr. Michael Ferguson, who wrote the book, The Drummer in the Great Mountain, about ADHD. And I've got other speakers as well to address many, many other aspects of these major kind of relapse triggers, or really they predispose us to relapse. And then the final thing that was just this huge relapse trigger was indeed the PTSD. And way back when, trauma was not being effectively addressed in treatment, and now it is. Now it is, as well as it could be, who knows, but it is at least being named as a major issue. Unlike when I first started my practice in Denver, when nobody had heard of it, but so many of my clients were relapsing because of their trauma and because of their deep, intense emotional pain from the trauma. Well, we don't have an amino acid that, waves a magic wand and makes trauma go away. But we can use our nutrients very powerfully to support the nervous system in healing from trauma and PTSD. Whether you've gone into hyperarousal and need to use theanine and some other things to calm down your nervous system, whether you've gone into hypoarousal and need to use tyrosine to bring you alive again, or diphenylalanine to just help you through the grieving process and with this deep emotional pain. We have the tools to help people manage their symptoms of PTSD while they were going through often very long-term trauma treatment. So these are just a few things that I learned in my 20-year practice working with people with chronic relapse, and we're going to be touching on them in this upcoming conference. And I'm so excited about it because nothing like this conference has happened ever before, where we're actually naming, identifying these situations that set us up for relapse, and then giving effective, easy, fast nutritional solutions. So I hope you all come. It's going to be available both online and in person in Columbus, Ohio, from April 30th through May 2nd. And you can click the link in the chat to sign up. We actually have a Valentine's Day sale going on. So if you sign up before the end of February, you will get some very real savings. I hope to see you all there. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Thanks, Christina, and everybody.
Thank you. Okay, Michael Hately.
Hately, thank you. Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, super fascinating. I'm kind of new kid on the block to this world. I'm also in recovering as a recovering human being, and I'm 13 years abstinent from food behaviors that were not great. So anyway, I had a question about how much study have you done about plant-based foods in addition to all the sort of regular foods that are out there. Have you done much research into that? And
I mean,
kind of curious about that
are
world.
you talking about your plant-based proteins or just your plant foods that give us all of our wonderful phytonutrients and vitamins and minerals and fibers and all these other really important things?
I guess specifically about the proteins, but also some of the other nutrients that you can get. Like, I know the fish oils are kind of a sticking point on and off because I'm a plant-based eater. I've been plant-based for about 5 years. It made an enormous difference in my life. But I'm curious about some other supplements that are not animal, based products, but plant-based products. I'm just curious
Absolutely.
how much work you've done in that world.
Quite a bit, because you're not the only plant-based person out there.
Oh yeah.
And so you can use flaxseed oil, a combination of flaxseed oil and blue-green algae as a source of the EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids. So the problem with just using flaxseed oil is that it's the EPA and your body actually needs to convert it. But bringing in your algae gives you your direct DHA that the body doesn't need to convert. And then, you may need to be supplementing with extra B12. You may need to be supplementing with some extra biotin or some extra carnitine, but all of that is possible. And just as long as you're getting your, 60 to 80 grams minimum of protein, with a whole variety of your amino acids,
Oh yeah.
you're going to be okay.
Great. Yeah, I mean, my recovery has been miraculous for me, and I eat about between 85 to 120, depending on how much I'm exercising in terms of protein. So I get plenty of protein, but it's all plant-based. But I know there's a bunch of other sort of bits and pieces of stuff that I feel great, but I'm curious in terms of, because I'm new to the recovery world, the substance abuse training world. That's really where, because I'm interested in this quite a bit. It makes a lot of sense to me because you change your food, you change your life, So anyway,
Absolutely.
thank you for everything.
Yeah, and I'm, in fact, I'd love you to write a little story about how you get your 120 grams of plant-based protein a day and how you do it for my nonprofit Eating Protein Saves Lives, where we have lots of ideas in there about how to get enough protein in. But, people who are plant-based don't know as much as you do and aren't as educated as you are and could use some help. So I'd love you to write something up for me.
Absolutely, I'd love to. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other questions?
Christina, I've got a question for you. This
Hi,
is Dylan.
Dylan.
Hi, it's been a while. I'm glad I could make it here today. Thank you. So for protein, I take in a lot of protein, actually. I was wondering, I take in almost 200 grams of protein. And I
Okay.
was wondering if you have, because I've heard different, as a personal trainer, I've heard different feedback on what's what's good for certain things. But I wondered if you had thoughts on the high end of that, or like, a suggested amount.
Protein needs is very individual, Dylan. It has to do with body type,
Okay.
age, body composition, blood type. Blood types do better on animal protein versus your A and B blood types. Right? A and B blood types can do better on plant-based proteins. Your activity level matters. Your ability to digest the protein matters. Some of us, as we get older, actually produce less digestive enzymes, less hydrochloric acid, less pepsin, less pancreatic enzymes, and people can really struggle to digest the higher amounts of protein and might need to bring in some digestive support. So it's
Okay.
really whatever works for you and your body.
Okay. Sounds good. The main thing is every 4 hours, have about 20 grams.
Keeping blood sugar absolutely balanced for most people.
Cool.
Now,
Cool.
some people do better with intermittent fasting, but not everyone. So you have to figure out for yourself where you lie on that little range.
Where would the intermittent fasting fall into that? When you say some people do better, are they not having protein like every 4
So some
hours?
people would do better if they have, for instance, a 16-hour fasting window and skip breakfast and don't really only
Okay.
eat within an 8-hour period of time. And these are
Yep.
people who've, very often really screwed up their metabolism. The problem is
Okay.
people in very
Gotcha.
early recovery do not appear to have the adrenal stability to manage that, and blood
Ah,
sugar can fluctuate wildly and really
okay.
set up cravings. So we do
Gotcha.
not recommend that for people in early recovery.
Got it. Cool. Thank you.
So welcome. Any other questions?
Hey, Christina, this is Shelley Joe, and I want to, first of all, I'm the president of the Alliance, so I want to thank everybody coming on here, but especially Christina, for those of you who are interested in taking her class, just a side note, myself and Dr. Valsa and Dr. Salvatore, who are the board members of the Alliance, all went through Christina's program. And it's amazing. She is amazing. I listen to you, and each time I do, Christina, the information you give me just gets me more and more excited. So thank you. I'm excited to come to Ohio. What you're teaching does work. So sending you love.
Shelley, thank you so much. I appreciate that endorsement. And you, of course, done amazing, wonderful things with this information. Okay, Russ has his hand up, and then I have to go.
Okay, any tips for someone with, the autoimmune Hashimoto's, dysregulated stress responses? The overreactive stress responses are really can sabotage the no sugar, no flour diet. So tips on that?
It really can. Um, Again, keeping blood sugar absolutely stable by eating that protein every 3 to 4 hours. Because if you go too long without food and your blood sugar drops, adrenaline kicks in. And adrenaline is what destabilizes us tremendously. So that's the foundational step. And then, working with all sorts of ways to learn how to stabilize your nervous system. All of the psychosocial techniques, the breathing techniques, the everything. But this is where we bring in our calmers, our magnesium, theanine, GABA, sometimes 5-HTP, to just calm down the nervous system. The adrenal support to support adrenal function so it's not all over the place. And it can be responding in a orderly, supportive manner rather than being destructive. And there's lots of adaptogenic herbs that can help with stabilizing adrenal function. and helping people, because it's exactly the same sort of thing you need to be bringing in people recovering from trauma. And in fact, Hashimoto's can be a response to people with trauma. Does that kind of answer some of it?
Yeah, that's provides the context of where the things I think I'm going to be looking at now.
Wonderful. And we have lots of information about the different calming amino acids and the different calming herbs. Working with one of our coaches or, would be, or medical professionals would be, I think, really helpful to you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, everybody, I need to leave, but it's been a pleasure being with you all. In fact, it's been an honor, and I hope to see many of you in 8 weeks in Columbus.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Christina. We'll see you in Columbus. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you. Thanks, Christina.